If you grew up in the 90s, you probably believe Zack Morris and Kelly Kapowski were the perfect couple in the world. Television stations printed their pictures on every poster and every teen lunchbox. But you were fooled. It was just a brainwashing marketing campaign. The truth is, behind the camera, the heart of the male lead, Mark Paul, belonged to the African-American supporting actress Lark Voorhies. They were madly in love for 3 years. But why never did you see them on magazine covers? Because 90s Hollywood decided to erase that romance, forcing the two young people to lie simply because their love didn't sell toys. Today we expose how a billion-dollar network manipulated our childhoods and erased a real love story for profit. In the late 1980s, the television landscape for adolescents was undergoing a massive seismic shift. The traditional Saturday morning lineup of animated cartoons was no longer holding the attention of older children and young teenagers. The result of this boardroom calculation was the creation of Bayside High School. It was a primary colored, perfectly clean universe where the biggest existential threats involved a lost football playbook, a failed midterm exam, or a mild misunderstanding at the local diner. But to successfully sell this artificial universe, the network needed archetypes that conservative middle American parents would instantly recognize and approve of. They needed to engineer a specific, highly marketable social hierarchy. At the absolute top of this hierarchy, they placed the character of Zack Morris. To play this role, they cast a 14-year-old boy named Mark Paul Gosselaar. Gosselaar was an incredibly talented young actor, but his casting involved a quiet, immediate act of industry erasure. What the 1990s media completely ignored and what the network deliberately downplayed was that Gosselaar was not the quintessential, pure-blooded Caucasian surfer boy they marketed him as. His mother was born in Indonesia, and he was of mixed Dutch-Indonesian descent. However, the Hollywood machine of the late 80s was not interested in celebrating multi-ethnic heritage. The executives looked at his bone structure and decided he would be their golden boy. They ordered him to dye his natural hair a blinding artificial bleach blonde every 2 weeks. They chemically burned his scalp to manufacture the ultimate, non-threatening white protagonist. He was tasked with carrying the financial weight of the entire franchise on his young shoulders. But a teenage king needs a queen. The corporate mandate required Zack Morris to have a counterpart, a prize to be won, a female equivalent of his all-American perfection. Enter Kelly Kapowski, played by Tiffany Thiessen. She was the quintessential brunette head cheerleader, the girl next door. Together, Zack and Kelly were designed from the ground up to be the real-life Ken and Barbie. This pairing was not an accident of casting. It was a strict boardroom directive. The network executives looked at the cultural landscape of early 90s America, a country still heavily divided by unspoken racial lines and conservative family values, and determined that this specific white-centric pairing was the safest, most lucrative image they could possibly project. This is where the true cold nature of the entertainment industry reveals itself. Before the teenage actors had even settled into their roles, before the writers had fully developed the storylines or tested the on-screen chemistry, the studio had already mobilized a massive multi-million-dollar merchandising apparatus. They invested heavily in licensing deals based strictly on the Zack and Kelly dynamic. They struck preemptive deals with manufacturing companies to produce board games, plastic thermoses, backpacks, and clothing lines. They partnered with massive teen publications like Tiger Beat, Bop, and 16 Magazine to ensure that the Zack and Kelly narrative would completely dominate the newsstands before the episodes even aired. The narrative of the show was entirely locked in by financial projections, not by human reality. The executives had bet the house on the blonde boy and the brunette cheerleader. If anything disrupted that specific image, millions of dollars in pre-manufactured merchandise would instantly become dead stock. While the executives were designing lunchboxes, a completely different, unscripted reality was unfolding in the casting room. The character of Lisa Turtle was originally written in the script as a wealthy, privileged, white Jewish girl from Long Island who was obsessed with shopping. It was a standard, slightly tired sitcom trope. But then, a 14-year-old black girl from Pasadena named Lark Voorhies walked into the audition room. Lark possessed a staggering, undeniable natural talent. She was razor sharp, possessed impeccable comedic timing, and radiated a sophisticated charm that completely dismantled the other actresses reading for the part. The producers were so entirely captivated by her performance that they did something incredibly rare for 1988 television. They rewrote the character specifically for her. Lark Voorhies broke a massive racial barrier simply by being too talented to ignore. However, her victory came with immediate unspoken caveats. While she had secured a role on a major network television show, a massive financial lifeline, and point of immense pride for her working-class family, the network instantly boxed her into a safe secondary tier. She was allowed to be the fashionable, sassy best friend, but she was implicitly barred from being the primary romantic lead. In the heavily segregated minds of the 1980s television executives, the black girl could deliver the punchlines, but the white girl had to get the boy. In 1989, as production officially began on Saved by the Bell, the young cast was thrust into a bizarre, isolating pressure cooker. They were legally children, but professionally they were corporate assets. They were pulled out of regular high schools and normal teenage socialization. Their daily reality consisted of grueling 14-hour days inside windowless sound stages in Los Angeles. They were surrounded by stressed adult producers, demanding directors, and aggressive studio tutors. The outside world ceased to exist, and it was within this crucible, far away from the flashing cameras of the teen magazines and the prying eyes of the network executives, that a genuine, unplanned human connection occurred. Mark Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies were both 15 years old. They were spending more time with each other than with their own families. Between takes, while waiting in the cramped, brightly lit backstage areas of the NBC lot, they began to talk. They found in each other a quiet, grounded refuge from the screaming directors and the artificiality of Bayside High. Mark Paul, the boy forced to chemically burn his hair to play the perfect white Californian, found himself deeply drawn to Lark's intelligence, her quiet confidence, and her sharp wit. Lark, navigating the immense lonely pressure of being the sole black female lead in a predominantly white production, found safety and genuine affection in Mark Paul. What began as a quiet friendship quickly and organically blossomed into a deep, intense teenage romance. It was not a brief, fleeting set crush. It was a foundational, highly committed relationship that would last for 3 consecutive years, spanning the most formative, critical period of their adolescence. They fell in love. It was a pure, innocent teenage romance, identical to the millions of high school relationships happening across America at that exact moment. They held hands off camera. They talked on the phone late into the night. They supported each other through the grueling production schedules. And they provided the emotional stability that the Hollywood machine actively tried to strip away from them. But their pure, real-world love story was fundamentally incompatible with the artificial universe they were employed to sell. On the sound stage, the director would yell, "Action!" Mark Paul would have to drop Lark's hand, step in front of the cameras, and perform a desperate, scripted infatuation for Kelly Kapowski. He had to look into Tiffany Thiessen's eyes and recite dialogue about how she was the only girl in the world or him. Lark was contractually obligated to stand in the background, delivering witty one-liners, forced to watch the boy she loved publicly romance another woman for the financial benefit of the network. At 15 years old, they were inadvertently creating a massive, terrifying problem for the NBC corporate machine. They were an interracial couple existing in an era where network television was terrified of alienating conservative advertisers. They were living, breathing proof that the Zack and Kelly narrative was a complete fabrication. As the calendar flipped into 1990, Saved by the Bell transitioned from a mildly successful Saturday morning experiment into an absolute, unstoppable cultural juggernaut. The ratings were not just high, they were paradigm shifting. NBC had successfully tapped into the veins of millions of American adolescents, capturing a massive audience that gathered around their television sets every weekend with religious devotion. With this meteoric rise in viewership came an unprecedented wave of real-world hysteria. The network executives decided to test the show's popularity by sending the cast on national mall tours. This level of sudden, suffocating fame is violently destabilizing for a developing human brain. At 16 years old, Mark, Paul, and Lark were no longer just kids from California. They were global commodities. Their financial reality shifted overnight. They were generating massive wealth, altering the power dynamics within their own families. Parents who had previously been the primary providers were suddenly managing the six-figure incomes of their children. The pressure was crushing. Every move they made was scrutinized by studio tutors, aggressive managers, and network handlers who viewed any deviation from the pristine Bayside image as a threat to their own paychecks. It was against this chaotic, terrifying backdrop of screaming crowds and corporate handlers that Mark, Paul, and Lark's relationship deepened from a quiet-set friendship into a profound, fiercely committed teenage romance. Their relationship became a vital psychological sanctuary. When the deafening noise of the mall tour subsided and they were finally allowed to retreat to the quiet confines of a hotel room or the back seat of a studio-chauffeured town car, they had each other. They understood the bizarre, isolating reality of their existence in a way that their families and civilian friends simply could not. Mark Paul, who was enduring the bizarre psychological split of being marketed as the ultimate Caucasian heartthrob, while privately navigating his own mixed Dutch-Indonesian heritage, found a deep resonance with Lark. Lark, in turn, carried the immense, unspoken burden of being the sole black female lead in a predominantly white pop culture phenomenon. She was navigating an industry that frequently treated her as an accessory rather than a focal point. Together they formed a united front against the artificiality of their daily lives. They went on actual dates heavily disguised to avoid the frantic teen paparazzi. They met each other's families. They experienced the universal milestones of adolescence. First cars, profound late-night phone conversations, the intense, overwhelming rush of first love, all while operating in the shadow of a billion-dollar television franchise. But secrets in Hollywood, especially secrets involving the primary assets of a hit television show, are impossible to keep. Eventually, the whispers on the soundstage reached the corporate offices. The producers and NBC network executives realized that their lead actor and their supporting actress were genuinely, deeply involved. From a human perspective, this should have been a non-issue. Two teenagers working in close proximity had fallen in love, but the executives did not look at them through a human lens. They looked at them through the cold, calculated lens of demographic marketing and advertiser retention. To the men in the boardroom, this interracial romance was not a cute behind-the-scenes anecdote. It was a terrifying system glitch. It was a massive financial liability. More importantly, it threatened the merchandise. The studio had already committed millions of dollars to the Zack and Kelly brand. Lunchboxes were rolling off assembly lines in overseas factories. Millions of posters had already been printed. The entire PR strategy was built on the fantasy that Mark Paul Gosselaar and Tiffany Thiessen were the ultimate American dream couple. Faced with the reality of Mark Paul and Lark's relationship, the network executed a swift, brutal campaign of silent segregation. They did not explicitly fire anyone, nor did they publicly forbid the teenagers from dating. Doing so would have risked a rebellion from their lead actor. Instead, they weaponized the PR machine to completely bury the truth under a mountain of manufactured lies. The executives instituted a strict, unspoken policy. Mark Paul and Lark were never to be photographed together in a romantic context. The studio's public relations department aggressively intervened in the cast's media appearances. When the massive teen magazines of the era, Tiger Beat, Big Bop, or 16 magazine, requested interviews and cover shoots, the network dictated the terms. They explicitly mandated that Mark Paul be paired almost exclusively with Tiffany Thiessen. The teenage actors were thrust into a bizarre, highly manipulative corporate theater. Mark Paul and Tiffany were contractually pushed to do joint interviews where they were instructed to act playfully flirtatious. They were ordered to pose for magazine covers, pressing their faces together, smiling brightly under bold neon headlines that screamed, "Zack and Kelly, are they dating in real life?" The publicists actively baited the fans, feeding rumors of a real-life romance between the two white leads to drive viewership and merchandise sales. Tiffany Thiessen, it must be noted, was not the villain in this scenario. She was also just a teenager, a pawn in the same corporate chess game, simply doing the job she was hired to do. But the mechanics of this PR strategy inflicted profound psychological damage on the two people who were actually in love. Imagine the reality of this situation for Lark Voorhies. She was 16 years old. She was brilliant, beautiful, and the co-star of a hit television show. She was deeply, genuinely in love with her boyfriend. Yet every single time she walked into a grocery store or a pharmacy, she was forced to look at magazine racks plastered with images of her actual boyfriend wrapping his arms around another girl. The psychological toll of this forced deception was devastating. The network was sending Lark a clear, unspoken, and incredibly racist message. Your talent is acceptable for the background, but your face is not marketable next to our leading man. They were implicitly telling a young black girl that her real-life romance, her actual humanity, was commercially worthless. She was forced to swallow her pride, step into the shadows, and watch the Hollywood machine erase her relationship from existence simply to appease the fragile sensibilities of conservative advertisers. For Mark Paul, the situation created a toxic cognitive dissonance. He was the star of the show, the supposed king of Bayside, but he was entirely powerless over his own life. He had no control over his image, his hair color, or his ability to publicly acknowledge the girl he loved. He was a highly paid prisoner. He had to sit in interview chairs, nod along as journalists asked him about his crush on Tiffany Thiessen, and outright lie to the public, knowing that Lark was likely watching or reading the final product. He he was forced to participate in the systematic erasure of his own relationship to protect a corporate lie. This was not a brief, uncomfortable week of press. This aggressive PR campaign lasted for years. The network systematically built a towering, inescapable wall of fiction around the cast. They commercialized the fabricated romance of Zack and Kelly, transforming it into one of the most iconic pop culture pairings of the decade, while actively smothering the genuine beating heart of the actual relationship happening right behind the cameras. The teenagers were learning that in the entertainment industry, truth is entirely irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the narrative printed on the lunchbox. By 1991, Saved by the Bell had completely outgrown the confines of its standard Saturday morning time slot. It had become a cultural institution. To capitalize on this unprecedented momentum, NBC executives decided to expand the universe of Bayside High. They moved the production out of the claustrophobic, windowless sound stages of Los Angeles and began filming massive on-location event arcs, including the famous summer episodes set at the Malibu Sands Beach Club, and eventually, a feature-length television movie shot entirely in Hawaii. For the viewing public, these episodes were a vibrant, sun-soaked expansion of the fantasy. But for Mark Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies, the shift to on-location filming drastically intensified the psychological warfare of their hidden relationship. When you film on a closed studio lot, the environment is highly regulated. But when a production moves to a public beach in Malibu or a resort in Hawaii, the paparazzi, the rabid teenage fans, and the network handlers multiply exponentially. The perimeter of their privacy shrank to almost nothing. In these locations, the corporate mandate to sell the Zack and Kelly illusion was cranked to its absolute maximum. Mark Paul and Tiffany Thiessen were constantly positioned together in the surf, on the sand, and in front of the cameras, physically embodying the golden Californian dream that the advertisers were paying millions to sponsor. Lark, meanwhile, was flown to these exotic locations only to be systematically pushed to the periphery of the frame. The writers rarely gave her character Lisa Turtle meaningful romantic arcs. Instead, they weaponized a specific, deeply problematic running gag that served as the ultimate tool of on-screen segregation, the relentless, unrequited obsession of Samuel Screech Powers. This dynamic is crucial to understanding the specific, nuanced cruelty inflicted upon Lark, because the network executives flatly refused to allow the beautiful, sophisticated black actress to be genuinely romanced by the handsome white leading man. They needed to neutralize her romantic presence on the show. They accomplished this by pairing her exclusively with the cast's designated clown. Screech, played by Dustin Diamond, was written as a socially inept, hyper-annoying outcast. His entire character motivation was a relentless, stalker-like pursuit of Lisa, which she was scripted to constantly reject with physical disgust and sassy one-liners. Consider the profound psychological dissonance this created for a 17-year-old girl. In her real life, Lark Voorhies was the deeply loved, highly respected partner of the most desired teenage boy in America. But the moment the director yelled action, she was contractually forced to play a girl whose only romantic value was being the punchline to a nerd's harassment. The network implicitly told the audience that a brilliant black girl was not worthy of the golden boy. She was only desired by the joke. Every single day, Lark had to deliver lines expressing revulsion toward her on-screen stalker, while simultaneously hiding her profound, genuine affection for the boy standing just out of the camera's view. For Mark Paul, Watching this dynamic unfold daily was its own form of agonizing captivity. He was maturing into a young man, developing a fierce protective instinct over his girlfriend. Yet he was completely castrated by his contract. He had to stand by and watch his real-life partner be reduced to a comedic prop, enduring the physical comedy and endless jokes at her expense, while he was handed scripts that ordered him to passionately kiss guest stars and his other female castmates. He was the undisputed king of the Bayside set, yet he possessed absolutely no power to defend the dignity of the woman he loved. To survive this suffocating environment, the couple had to construct a highly sophisticated, clandestine, parallel existence. As they turned 17, a crucial shift occurred in their personal autonomy. They secured their driver's licenses and purchased their own vehicles. In the sprawling, heavily congested geography of Los Angeles, a car is not just a mode of transportation. It is a fortress. For Mark, Paul, and Lark, the heavy steel doors of their automobiles became their only true sanctuaries. Their vehicles were the only places completely devoid of studio tutors, aggressively hovering parents, and NBC public relations executives. The moment they drove off the studio lot, they were no longer corporate commodities. They were just a boy and a girl navigating the LA freeways. They utilized the legendary Los Angeles traffic as a shield. They would coordinate their departures, slipping away from the set at different times to avoid arousing suspicion from the paparazzi camped outside the studio gates. They would meet in secluded parking lots, in the back booths of obscure diners far away from the Hollywood epicenter, or in the quiet, heavily tinted privacy of their cars. These stolen hours were their lifeline. It was in these isolated pockets of time that they could drop the heavy, exhausting masks they wore for the cameras. Mark Paul did not have to project the arrogant swagger of Zack Morris. He could just be a teenager exhausted by the demands of his own fame. Lark did not have to project the shallow materialism of Lisa Turtle. She could be the deeply intelligent, grounded young woman she actually was. However, maintaining a secret of this magnitude requires a staggering expenditure of emotional energy. A 3-year relationship is a massive undertaking for any teenager under normal circumstances. Adolescence is inherently volatile, defined by rapid biological changes, shifting identities, and intense emotional peaks and valleys. But Mark, Paul, and Lark were not operating under normal circumstances. They were attempting to sustain a foundational romance inside a billion-dollar pressure cooker that was actively trying to boil them alive. The financial reality of their situation only added to the terrifying weight they carried. By 1992, they were the primary breadwinners for their respective families. They were employing managers, agents, and lawyers. They were legally children, but they were paying the mortgages. If they rebelled, if they decided to walk onto the set holding hands and openly declare their relationship to the press, they would not just be risking their own careers. They would be risking the financial stability of everyone in their orbit. The network held their livelihoods hostage. The executives knew that the teenagers were trapped by their own success, entirely dependent on the syndication checks and the weekly salaries to keep their families afloat. This toxic combination of forced deception, financial pressure, and intense public scrutiny slowly began to erode the foundation of their sanctuary. The secret world they had built in the back seats of their cars was beautiful, but it was structurally unsound. You cannot indefinitely sustain a relationship in the dark. A genuine romance requires the oxygen of public acknowledgement. It requires the ability to walk down a street, go to a movie theater, or attend a high school prom without the terrifying fear of being photographed and subsequently punished by your employer. As Saved by the Bell approached the end of its high school run, preparing to transition the characters into a new collegiate spin-off, the heavy invisible toll of their 3-year deception reached a critical mass. The teenagers had successfully hidden their love from the world, protecting it from the predatory tabloid press, but the internal cost of that protection was bankrupting their spirits. The corporate machine had not managed to stop them from falling in love, but it was actively, systematically making it impossible for them to survive it. By late 1992, the Bayside High School phenomenon was hurtling toward its inevitable, highly publicized conclusion. The cast members were no longer the fresh-faced 14-year-olds who had initially signed their contracts. They were officially aging out of the Saturday morning demographic. Mark Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies were approaching 18. They were crossing the threshold into legal adulthood, yet they were still fundamentally tethered to the brightly colored lockers and the screeching audience laugh tracks that had defined their entire adolescence. The NBC network, however, was not about to let a billion-dollar intellectual property simply graduate and disappear. The executives devised a strategy to extend the lifespan of their investment. They would transition the core characters into a new primetime spinoff titled Saved by the Bell: The College Years. For the viewing audience, this announcement was thrilling. It promised a more mature, sophisticated look at their favorite characters navigating the perils of university life. But behind the closed doors of the executive suites, a ruthless, surgical culling of the cast was taking place. The network ran their demographic metrics, analyzed their merchandise sales, and decided that they did not need the entire ensemble to anchor a primetime slot. They only needed the characters they deemed to be the most commercially viable. They kept Mark Paul Gosselaar. They kept Mario Lopez. They kept Dustin Diamond. And eventually they brought back Tiffany Thiessen. They discarded Lark Voorhies. The character of Lisa Turtle, the brilliant, fashion-forward, razor-sharp comedic core of the original series, was not invited to college. This decision was not based on a lack of acting ability. Lark was arguably one of the most naturally gifted performers in the entire ensemble. The decision was rooted in the exact same cold, unspoken corporate segregation that had forced her to hide her real-life romance for 3 years. The executives looked at the primetime landscape of 1993, a fiercely competitive arena heavily dominated by white-centric programming like Beverly Hills 90210 and Melrose Place, and determined that a young black woman did not fit their formula for Tuesday night ratings success. This corporate severance was a brutal, devastating blow, and it fundamentally altered the trajectory of both Lark's career and her 3-year relationship with Mark Paul. Imagine the psychological whiplash inflicted upon Lark Voorhies in the spring of 1993. For 4 years, she had dedicated her life to the NBC machine. She had sacrificed her normal teenage years, endured grueling 14-hour workdays, and suffered the quiet daily humiliation of having her genuine real-world romance erased by the PR department. She had helped build a global empire. Yet the moment she turned 18, the network unceremoniously thanked her for her service, stripped her of her steady paycheck, and locked her out of the studio gates. While Mark Paul was handed a lucrative new contract, a massive pay bump, and the prestige of leading a primetime television show, Lark was abruptly thrust into the terrifying, unforgiving reality of the 1990s Hollywood audition circuit. The chasm between their daily realities instantly became a vast, unbridgeable gulf. Mark Paul continued to drive to the same studio lot, stepping onto a newly built college set, surrounded by the same producers, the same directors, and the same protective corporate bubble that had shielded him since he was a child. He was the golden boy, transitioning seamlessly into his next highly paid chapter. Lark, however, was suddenly navigating an industry that was notoriously aggressively hostile to young black actresses. The roles available to her were scarce, heavily stereotyped, and fiercely contested. Furthermore, she was carrying the heavy double-edged sword of her own massive fame. When she walked into a casting office for a serious dramatic role, the casting directors did not see a versatile, talented 18-year-old actress. They only saw Lisa Turtle. She was heavily typecast, trapped by the very caricature the network had paid her to create. Yet she was no longer receiving the network's protection or financial support. This sudden, violent disparity in their professional lives introduced a toxic, unavoidable strain into their relationship. How do you maintain a high-stakes, deeply committed romance when one partner is actively being celebrated by the industry and the other has just been callously discarded by it? Mark Paul was forced to grapple with a complex, suffocating sense of survivor's guilt. He loved Lark deeply, but he was contractually bound to a machine that had just fired her. Every day he went to work and performed alongside a cast that she was supposed to be a part of. He was living the prime-time dream that they had likely spoken about during those late-night conversations in the back seats of their cars. He possessed the immense privilege of job security, while the woman he loved was facing the terrifying prospect of unemployment and industry rejection. Lark, conversely, was forced to navigate the profound sting of professional betrayal while trying to support her boyfriend's ongoing success. She had to watch him continue to be marketed alongside Tiffany Thiessen, continuing the exact same Zack and Kelly charade that had plagued them in high school. Only now, she wasn't even allowed in the building. The daily indignities of auditioning, of being rejected because she was too recognizable, or because a role wasn't written for a minority, began to heavily tax her emotional reserves. The secret world they had meticulously built to protect their love, the quiet diners, the heavily tinted cars, the shared understanding of the Bayside pressure cooker, was no longer sufficient. Their sanctuary had been designed to protect them from the paparazzi and the teen magazines. It was not equipped to withstand the heavy, crushing realities of adult unemployment, systemic industry racism, and wildly diverging socio-economic futures. The collapse of their relationship did not happen in a fiery, dramatic explosion. There were no tabloid scandals, no public screaming matches, and no bitter betrayals. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing erosion. The sheer exhaustion of having hidden their love for 3 years, combined with the immense, sudden stress of the real world crashing down upon them, simply depleted their emotional bank accounts. They were 18 years old. They had fought a multi-billion-dollar PR machine for the right to love each other. And for 3 years, they had won. But human beings possess a finite amount of resilience. The network had finally succeeded in destroying their relationship, not by explicitly forbidding them to date, but by violently splitting their environment apart. The corporate acts that severed Lark from the cast ultimately severed the connective tissue of their romance. They quietly, painfully let each other go. The end of their relationship marked the final tragic victory for the 1990s Hollywood machine. The executives had successfully extracted every ounce of comedic value from Lark Voorhies, utilized her to build their franchise, and then discarded her the moment she was no longer deemed a demographic necessity. They had protected their white-centric merchandise, preserved the Zack and Kelly illusion, and ensured that the reality of Mark Paul and Lark's interracial romance would never see the light of day. For the audience at home, tuning in to watch the college years, nothing appeared to be wrong. Zack Morris was still scheming, Kelly Kapowski was still smiling, and the laugh track was still roaring. The viewers were completely blind to the fact that the cheerful blonde protagonist on their screen was a young man quietly mourning the loss of his first great love, a love that had been systematically suffocated by the very people paying his salary. The immediate aftermath of a teenage breakup is traditionally defined by a necessary physical distance. High school students change their locker routes, avoid shared cafeterias, and rely on their peer groups to insulate them from the pain of seeing their ex-partner. But for Mark Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies, the Hollywood machine flatly denied them this basic human luxury. The cancellation of their relationship was a private tragedy, but the industry they worked for was about to force them into a highly public, unimaginably cruel reunion designed entirely to finalize the corporate lie that had torn them apart in the first place. In late 1993, NBC's primetime experiment, Saved by the Bell, the college years, failed. Despite the heavy marketing and the retention of the core white cast members, the show could not compete in the aggressive Tuesday night ratings war. It was swiftly canceled after a single season. However, the network executives realized they still had a massive, rabid fan base that felt cheated by the abrupt cancellation. To extract the final, ultimate payday from the franchise, NBC greenlit a 2-hour television movie event designed to give the audience the exact fairy tale ending the merchandise had been promising for 5 years. The movie was titled Saved by the Bell, Wedding in Las Vegas. The premise was simple and highly lucrative. Zack Morris and Kelly Kapowski were going to get married. The Ken and Barbie dolls were finally going to be permanently boxed together. To make the event feel authentic to the fans, the network needed to assemble the entire original cast. They reached out to Lark Voorhies, offering her a contract to reprise the role of Lisa Turtle for the movie. This contract offer placed Lark in an agonizing financial and psychological trap. By 1994, she was a working 19-year-old actress trying to survive in a deeply competitive, racially biased industry. The financial reality of a former child star is stark. You do not have a standard college degree to fall back on. Your resume consists entirely of television credits. She had a mortgage, living expenses, and a family that had grown accustomed to her income. She could not afford to reject a massive network paycheck out of pride. She needed the money, and she needed the screen time to remind casting directors of her comedic timing. She signed the contract. She agreed to return. What followed on the set of Wedding in Las Vegas was a scenario of such profound emotional cruelty that it is difficult to fathom how the actors survived it without breaking down on camera. Lark was flown to Nevada to join a production that was explicitly dedicated to celebrating the fabricated romance that had actively destroyed her own. She was not returning as an equal. The script dictated that she was there strictly as a supporting player, a background accessory to the Zack and Kelly narrative. The wardrobe department handed her a bridesmaid dress. Consider the surreal, agonizing psychological torture of this specific production detail. Just months prior, Lark and Mark Paul had been deeply in love, holding hands in the quiet sanctuary of their cars, navigating the intense reality of a 3-year, highly committed relationship. Now, she was contractually obligated to stand at a beautifully decorated altar under blinding cinematic lights, wearing a pastel bridesmaid gown, and watch her real-life ex-boyfriend exchange vows of eternal love with the exact same woman the network had used to erase her existence. When the director yelled, "Action," Mark Paul had to look at Tiffany Thiessen, slide a wedding ring onto her finger, and kiss her for the cameras. Lark had to stand just a few feet away, completely in focus, and forcefully smile. She had to project tears of joy for her fictional friends, while actively suppressing the deep, unresolved grief of her own shattered reality. The network was literally marrying off the PR lie, and they were forcing the hidden truth to stand in the background and applaud. It was the ultimate, sickening victory for the NBC marketing department. They had taken a genuine, beautiful, interracial teenage romance, buried it alive, and then paid the victims to dance on its grave. The executives secured their ratings smash. The movie was a massive commercial success, drawing in millions of viewers who eagerly consumed the Zack and Kelly wedding, entirely blind to the emotional blood on the floor of the Las Vegas sound stage. When production wrapped on the movie, the cast finally permanently disbanded, but the psychological shrapnel of that specific experience embedded itself deeply into Lark's psyche. How does a young woman process a breakup when there is absolutely no physical evidence that the relationship ever existed? Normal teenagers have photo albums, prom pictures, and shared mementos to validate their history. Lark had nothing. Because of the network's aggressive segregation policy, she had never walked a red carpet with Mark Paul. They had never been interviewed as a couple. There were no magazine covers documenting their 3 years together. Their love had only existed in the fleeting, undocumented moments between takes and behind the heavily tinted glass of their cars. When it ended, she was forced to grieve in absolute terrifying silence. She could not speak to the press about her heartbreak because the relationship was a closely guarded corporate secret. She could not seek validation from the fans because the fans had been brainwashed to believe that Zack belonged to Kelly. She was entirely alone, carrying the heavy, invisible ghost of a 3-year romance that the entire world insisted was a fiction. As the mid-1990s progressed, the vast disparity between their professional trajectories widened into an unbridgeable gulf, highlighting the systemic inequities of the Hollywood machine. Mark Paul Gosselaar benefited immensely from the safety net provided to white male protagonists. Despite the failure of the college years, the industry did not discard him. They allowed him to grow up. He transitioned into made-for-television movies, secured episodic guest-starring roles, and eventually shed his teenage image completely to land a prestigious long-running role on the gritty adult drama NYPD Blue. He was granted the privilege of evolution. The industry viewed his time as Zack Morris not as a permanent brand, but as a successful launching pad. Lark Voorhies was granted no such evolution. The industry looked at her and saw a very specific, limited commodity. She secured steady work, but it was grueling and heavily stereotyped. She was cast in the hit soap opera Days of Our Lives, and later The Bold and the Beautiful. While soap operas provided a vital, steady income stream, they are widely considered a step down in the television hierarchy from a primetime network lead. Furthermore, the daily reality of daytime television is an industrial meat grinder. Actors are required to memorize up to 30 pages of dialogue a day, filming multiple episodes in a single afternoon with virtually no time for rehearsal or nuanced performance. It is an exhausting, relentless factory job. More importantly, the roles she was offered frequently boxed her back into the exact same archetype she had played at Bayside. She was constantly cast as the sassy black friend, the fashionable sidekick, or the secondary romantic interest. She was rarely given the opportunity to anchor a narrative, to be the undeniable lead, or to showcase the profound dramatic depth she actually possessed. The systemic racism of 1990s casting directors ensured that she bumped her head against a glass ceiling that Mark Paul had effortlessly floated right through. The sheer exhaustion of fighting this uphill battle began to quietly erode her spirit. She was working relentlessly, yet she was constantly fighting to prove her worth to an industry that had already demonstrated it viewed her as a disposable asset. She had given her entire childhood to a corporation that erased her first love, and now she was giving her early 20s to a system that refused to see her as a leading lady. The physical and mental toll of carrying these heavy, unacknowledged traumas in total silence is a slow, corrosive process. You can only wear a mask for so long before the plastic begins to fuse with your skin. Lark was an incredibly private, deeply intelligent young woman who had been trained by her employers to swallow her pain and project a flawless, fashionable smile. But beneath the surface, the unresolved grief of her stolen youth, the silent erasure of her relationship, and the relentless pressure of a discriminatory industry were quietly building toward a breaking point. As the 1990s bled into the 2000s, the vast echoing silence surrounding the true history of Saved by the Bell began to take a different kind of toll. The actors were no longer teenagers navigating the awkward transition into adulthood. They were fully grown professionals operating in an industry that was rapidly, violently evolving. The rise of digital media, reality television, and the internet tabloid culture was about to fundamentally alter the rules of celebrity survival. For Mark Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies, this new era would expose the terrifying long-term consequences of the corporate segregation they had endured, revealing a financial and psychological landscape that was completely, unfairly tilted. To comprehend the sheer pressure Lark Voorhies faced in the early 2000s, one must dismantle a pervasive, enduring myth about 1990s television stars, the myth of endless syndication wealth. The general public operates under the assumption that if an actor starred on a globally recognized television program, they are financially insulated for life. They look at the cast of Friends, who famously negotiated contracts granting them lucrative back-end points, ensuring millions of dollars in residual checks decades after the show ended. But the cast of Saved by the Bell did not get Friends money. They were victims of standard, highly exploitative 1980s child actor contracts. When Mark Paul and Lark signed their initial paperwork at 14 years old, they were paid a flat, relatively modest episodic rate. They were not granted percentage points on the back-end syndication. They were not given a cut of the massive multi-million-dollar merchandising empire. Every time an episode aired on cable networks, which during the late 1990s and early 2000s was multiple times a day across dozens of countries, NBC and the production companies absorbed almost the entirety of the profit. The actors received statistically insignificant, heavily diluted residual checks. This brutal financial reality meant that they could not simply rest on their teenage laurels. They had to keep working to survive. But as we have established, the industry did not offer an even playing field for their continued employment. Mark Paul Gosselaar was able to navigate this financial vulnerability because the Hollywood system actively supported his transition into adult roles. He was a white, conventionally attractive leading man with a proven track record. The industry viewed his past as a reliable resume. When the teenage roles dried up, he seamlessly transitioned into procedural dramas and legal series like Franklin and Bash. He was continuously employed, insulated by a steady stream of high-profile network paychecks. His financial security provided a vital psychological buffer. He could afford to look back at his time as Zack Morris with a sense of nostalgic, detached amusement. The show was a stepping stone, not a permanent prison. For Lark Voorhies, the lack of syndication wealth triggered a terrifying high-stakes battle for survival in an industry that was actively turning its back on her. When her soap opera contracts eventually concluded, she found herself staring into a professional void. The systemic racism of Hollywood casting in the early 2000s was unrelenting. The roles available for a black actress in her late 20s were abysmal, often limited to offensive caricatures or deeply marginalized supporting characters. The Hollywood machine had happily extracted her youth, utilized her comedic brilliance to build their franchise, and denied her the financial security of her own merchandise. Now, they were denying her the dignity of a continuous career. It is within this grueling, exhausting context of professional rejection and financial anxiety that the heavy, unresolved traumas of her adolescence began to fracture her reality. Psychological trauma is not a static event. It is a progressive, corrosive condition. For a decade, Lark had been forced to swallow her pride. She had been forced to hide her 3-year relationship with Mark Paul. She had been forced to stand in the background while a corporate lie was celebrated. She had been fired from the primetime spinoff. She had endured the crushing weight of being a young black pioneer in a white-dominated pop culture space without ever receiving the reverence or support that such a position demands. The human mind can only compartmentalize that level of systemic invalidation for so long before the walls begin to buckle. As Lark retreated from the heavily guarded, sanitized circles of Hollywood to seek privacy, a new, far more predatory media apparatus was waiting for her. The early 2000s birthed the era of the digital tabloid. Blogs like TMZ and Perez Hilton fundamentally changed the paparazzi industry. They were no longer just looking for glamorous red carpet photos. They actively hunted for vulnerability. They monetized human destruction. When Lark Voorhies occasionally emerged in public during this era, the media did not treat her with the respect owed to a veteran actress. They treated her as a target. Photographs and videos began to surface online showing Lark looking visibly different, her demeanor altered, her speech patterns occasionally erratic. The internet reaction was swift, ruthless, and entirely devoid of empathy. The digital sphere branded her with the ultimate lazy cultural dismissal, the crazy former child star. Bloggers mocked her makeup. Commentators dissected her behavior with gleeful cruelty. Viral videos were circulated explicitly to invite public ridicule. The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of this cultural moment is sickening. The exact same society that had eagerly consumed her childhood, the society that had sat in front of their televisions and laughed at her jokes while she was silently bleeding off camera, was now actively mocking her psychological collapse. No one in the mainstream media paused to ask why she was struggling. No one bothered to investigate the massive, suffocating corporate pressures she had been subjected to since she was 14. No one connected her fragile mental state to the fact that her fundamental reality, her first love, Her teenage years, her professional worth, had been systematically erased by television executives. Instead of offering grace, the culture offered a digital guillotine. Eventually, Lark's mother, Tricia Voorhies, gave a heartbreaking interview to a major entertainment news outlet, revealing that her daughter had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It was a desperate plea for compassion, an attempt to explain that Lark was battling a severe, complex psychiatric illness that required medical intervention, not public mockery. But the revelation of a clinical diagnosis did not stop the cruelty. It merely categorized it. The Hollywood establishment, the former network executives who had built their summer homes on the money she generated, offered no public support. They remained entirely silent. They washed their hands of the human wreckage they had helped create. He was happily married, raising children, and engaging in thoughtful, respectful interviews about his acting process. He was allowed to be a complex, evolving human being. Lark was frozen in the public consciousness as a tragic spectacle. It is crucial to state that Mark Paul Gosselaar was not responsible for Lark's mental health struggles, nor was he the architect of the media's cruelty. He was living his own life, navigating his own career, but his seamless, highly protected integration into adult Hollywood prestige serves as a brutal, undeniable measuring stick. It highlights the vast systemic privilege afforded to the white male leading man, and the absolute lack of a safety net for the black female supporting actress. When a white male child's star struggles, the industry frequently offers rehabilitation, redemption narratives, and second chances. They are framed as troubled geniuses or rebellious youths finding their way. When a black female child star struggles, she is immediately stripped of her dignity, heavily stereotyped, and discarded into the cultural trash bin as a cautionary tale. For years, Lark bore this public humiliation in silence. She did not write a tell-all memoir. She did not launch a bitter media campaign against her former employers. She attempted to manage her illness privately, fighting a grueling daily battle against her own neurochemistry, while the internet continued to use her face as a punchline. She was entirely alone with her history. The 3-year romance that had defined her adolescence remained a buried secret. The world still believed that Zack Morris and Kelly Kapowski were the true story. Lark was carrying the weight of a ghost that no one else acknowledged. The systemic erasure implemented by the NBC PR department in 1990 had worked perfectly. It had successfully rewritten history, leaving Lark stranded on an island of her own truth, surrounded by an ocean of corporate lies. But the truth is an incredibly stubborn element. You can bury it under millions of dollars of merchandise, you can fire the people who lived it, and you can distract the public with decades of digital noise. But eventually the individuals who are forced to carry the lie grow tired of the weight. The adults who were once terrified, contractually bound teenagers eventually find their voices. The dam of corporate silence, built so carefully by the executives of the 1990s, was finally preparing to break. For nearly 2 decades, the true narrative of Bayside High remained buried under a mountain of syndication royalties and cheap nostalgia. The 1990s had been safely packaged and sold into the cultural rearview mirror. The world moved on, entirely comfortable with the fabricated history that Zack Morris and Kelly Kapowski were the defining romance of a generation. But history has a way of violently asserting itself when it is least expected. The truth, meticulously hidden by network executives and PR tycoons, did not emerge through an explosive tabloid expose or a bitter legal battle. It leaked out in the most casual, jarringly ordinary way imaginable. highlighting the terrifying privilege of time and the stark, enduring divide between the two people who actually lived it. The revelation arrived in the era of the celebrity podcast. By the late 2000s, Mark Paul Gosselaar was a highly respected, deeply insulated Hollywood veteran. He had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of child stardom, built a robust resume of adult dramatic roles, and settled into a comfortable, wealthy family life. He possessed the ultimate luxury of the successful actor. He could finally look back at his embarrassing teenage years with a sense of detached, fond amusement. During an interview on a popular podcast, and later on his own retrospective show, Zack to the Future, Gosselaar was asked about the behind-the-scenes dynamics of Saved by the Bell. Sitting in a comfortable studio, entirely free from the aggressive network handlers that had policed his every word in 1990, he simply told the truth. With a nostalgic smile and a casual shrug of his shoulders, he confessed that his great love during the show was not Tiffany Thiessen. He casually dropped the bombshell that he and Lark Voorhies had been in a deeply committed, genuine relationship that lasted for 3 years. He spoke about the extreme isolation of the sound stages, noting that the cast only had each other and that he and Lark had found a profound real-world connection amidst the plastic reality of the television studio. The internet reaction was instantaneous. Entertainment blogs and pop culture commentators scrambled to process the revelation. Headlines exploded across social media. Zack and Lisa were actually dating. The public, who had been aggressively conditioned to worship the blonde boy and the brunette cheerleader, was suddenly confronted with the fact that they had been sold a massive, racially segregated lie. But if you strip away the viral shock value of the headline, the confession is utterly heartbreaking in its asymmetry. Listen to the tone of Gosselaar's admission. For him, a white, wealthy, continuously employed male actor in his 40s, the relationship is a sweet, distant memory. He can afford to unbury the secret because the secret no longer possesses the power to hurt him. The NBC executives who threatened his early career are long gone. The advertisers who demanded a white-centric romance are irrelevant. He is safe. But for Lark Voorhies, this belated public validation arrived decades too late. The damage had already been permanently etched into her life. When she was a vulnerable 16-year-old girl, the acknowledgement of that relationship could have changed her entire trajectory. It could have validated her worth in an industry that actively sought to diminish her. It could have shielded her from the agonizing psychological toll of being pushed into the background. It could have given her the public dignity of simply holding her boyfriend's hand. Instead, the confession arrived long after her youth was exhausted, long after her career had been derailed by systemic casting prejudices, and long after the internet had cruelly mocked her mental health struggles. Mark Paul's casual admission was a fascinating piece of trivia for the audience. For Lark, it was the ghost of a stolen youth finally being given permission to speak long after the funeral was over. This asymmetry was thrust into the spotlight in 2020 in the most brutal corporate manner imaginable. The streaming wars had begun. NBC Universal launched its new digital platform, Peacock, and the executives desperately needed recognizable intellectual property to drive subscriptions. They turned to their most reliable, lucrative asset, Saved by the Bell. A massive high-budget reboot was greenlit. The studio reached out to the original cast to reprise their roles as adults. Mark Paul Gosselaar was invited back. Tiffany Thiessen was invited back. Mario Lopez and Elizabeth Berkley were contracted as series regulars and producers. The corporate machine was reassembling the Golden Children for another massive payday. Lark Voorhies was sitting in her living room, when she found out about the reboot. She did not receive a phone call from a producer. She did not receive a script or a contract. She read about the reunion of her own television family on the internet, exactly like the rest of the civilian world. The sheer breathtaking audacity of this exclusion is difficult to process. After everything Lark had given to the NBC network, her childhood, her comedic brilliance, her silent compliance in the erasure of her own romance, the current generation of executives still viewed her as entirely expendable. In 2020, during a year defined by a global reckoning over racial inequality and the systemic mistreatment of Black women in media, the Hollywood machine still looked at the Saved by the Bell legacy and decided that the Black actress was not required. The psychological devastation of this moment cannot be overstated. Lark Voorhies was forced to go on national television, appearing on the Dr. Oz show, to publicly process the humiliation of being excluded. Looking directly into the camera, exhibiting a quiet, agonizing vulnerability, she admitted that she felt slighted and deeply hurt. She expressed the profound pain of watching her former castmates, including the man who was once the love of her life, gather together to celebrate a legacy that she had helped build while she was left out in the cold. She was essentially experiencing the trauma of 1993 all over again. The network was doing exactly what they had done when they transitioned the show to the college years. They were extracting the white cast members for the prestige project and discarding her. It was a terrifying, repetitive loop of corporate rejection. However, unlike the early 1990s, the audience in 2020 possessed a voice. The public outcry was immediate and furious. Fans who had grown up watching Lisa Turtle, now adults who recognized the undeniable systemic racism of her exclusion, flooded social media. They demanded to know why the fashion icon of Bayside High was missing from the reunion. The pressure on the Peacock network became a public relations nightmare. Faced with a massive backlash that threatened to derail their expensive new streaming asset, the executives panicked. They executed a swift, frantic piece of corporate damage control. They reached out to Lark's representatives and hastily negotiated a contract for a brief, incredibly limited cameo appearance in the reboot. Lark accepted the offer. She appeared briefly on screen, reprising her role as a successful fashion designer. The network issued self-congratulatory press releases, celebrating the return of the entire original cast. But the victory was entirely hollow. It was not an organic, respectful inclusion born of artistic appreciation. It was a begrudging, forced concession born of PR terror. They did not invite her back because they valued her legacy. They invited her back because the internet forced their hand. They had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that the discriminatory corporate DNA that had infected Bayside High in 1989 was still perfectly intact 30 years later. When we analyze the complete, unvarnished history of Mark-Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies, we are forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about our own consumption of media. We are the final essential component of the PR machine. The television industry did not erase their interracial romance in a vacuum. They erased it because they calculated, perhaps accurately, that the American public of the early 1990s was not ready to buy a lunchbox featuring a white boy and a black girl in love. The executives built the Zack and Kelly illusion because we eagerly, blindly paid for it. We demanded that our teenage stars be flawless, sanitized, and neatly categorized into racially segregated boxes. We worshiped the plastic dolls, entirely oblivious to the fact that the human beings trapped inside the plastic were slowly suffocating to death. Mark Paul Gosselaar and Lark Voorhies were not fictional characters. They were living, breathing children. They experienced the terrifying, overwhelming rush of their first great love under the blinding lights of a soundstage. It was a pure, foundational human experience that should have been celebrated, documented, and cherished. Instead, it was treated as dead stock. It was viewed as a liability to the bottom line. They were forced to whisper their affections in the dark. They were ordered to perform a corporate lie to protect the merchandise. And when the lie was no longer profitable, the machine violently dismantled their lives, sending one into a heavily guarded fortress of Hollywood prestige and throwing the other into a grueling, decades-long battle for survival and mental stability.